She offered her body for a ride, but the cowboy put her on his horse and said, "You're safe now." Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The late summer heat pressed steadily over the Wyoming territory, settling into every patch of dirt and scrub along the long road between Pine Brush Crossing and the scattered ranch country to the north. The land didn't offer shade or water for miles, and the trail stayed so quiet that most riders could hear their own heartbeat under the sound of wind brushing across dry grass. Dawson Hale had ridden this stretch too many times to count, and he knew every bend, every low dip in the road, and every place where bandits once hid 10 or 15 years back. He kept his pace slow, letting his mare breathe after the long cattle run he had finished that morning, and he kept one hand on the reins while the other rested loosely near his thigh. His shirt was open at the collar from the heat, and dust clung to the creases above his boots from hours of riding. Dawson had been on the trail since sunrise, heading home after delivering 4 dozen head of cattle to a rancher near Pine Brush Crossing. He had taken the job because he needed the money and because working alone suited him better than dealing with town life. Crowds made him tense. Loud voices reminded him of the fight he barely survived years ago, and he preferred the steady routine of checking fences, hauling water, and finishing chores in silence. He planned to reach his homestead before nightfall, eat whatever he had left in his pantry, and sleep early so he could repair a broken section of his west fence the next morning. That was the whole shape of his life, simple, predictable, and quiet. He didn't expect to see anyone on the trail, let alone a woman walking barefoot with her dress damaged in several places. Sadie Grant appeared first as a faint shape in the heat shimmer, her figure moving slowly and unevenly along the dusty road. Dawson narrowed his eyes, straightened in the saddle, and studied her from a distance before nudging the mare forward. As he came closer, details sharpened. Sadie's dress hung crooked at her hips where the seam had ripped earlier, and the fabric across her chest had torn downward from the struggle she had escaped, leaving the soft line between her breasts visible each time she pulled the cloth up to cover herself. Her shoulder was open to the air where the stitching had split, and the dirt on her legs looked thick enough to have come from hours of stumbling. She carried no bag, no boots, no water, just the stubborn strength needed to keep walking. Sadie had been on foot since dawn. She had fled 2 men who dragged her from the roadside near Pine Brush Crossing, intending to force her onto a wagon headed for a mining camp. They chose her because she was alone, young, and had no family nearby to notice her missing. She escaped when the wagon wheel hit a rut, and both men jumped down to fix it. She ran until her lungs hurt and didn't dare return for her shoes, which one of the men had thrown aside to slow her down. Now she walked because stopping meant she might collapse, and collapsing meant those men could catch up if they were nearby. She kept telling herself to move, to breathe, to stay alert, even though each step made her legs shake harder. Her thoughts circled the same fears again and again. If another man rides by, he might be the same as the others. She tried to stand straighter whenever she heard hoofbeats, telling herself she could bargain if she had to, defend herself if she had to, or run if there was any chance left. Shame pressed in her chest each time she remembered offering herself to strangers in worse moments of her life, and she hated that survival kept forcing her into choices she despised. When Dawson drew close enough for her to see his face under the brim of his hat, she froze. His horse slowed on its own, and the mare's ears twitched at the sight of her. Sadie swallowed and forced herself to meet his eyes. He looked older than she expected, broad-shouldered with a trimmed beard and lines around his eyes that came from years of weather, not age. He didn't look cruel, but she had learned not to trust first impressions. He stopped the mare a few yards from her. The silence stretched sharply. Dust drifted lazily between them, and Sadie steadied her breathing because she didn't want him to see how close she was to panic. "I need a ride," she said, her voice thin but steady enough. She clenched her fingers deeper into the torn neckline of her dress. "I can pay, however you want." Her cheeks tightened as soon as the words left her mouth. She expected him to stare at her chest, bargain, or smirk. She braced herself for it, jaw tightening. eyes lowering. Dawson didn't react the way she feared. He watched her closely, but his gaze didn't drop to her exposed skin. He didn't lean forward or shift in his saddle to study her body. Instead, his expression stayed unreadable, but not cold, more like a man weighing what she wasn't saying. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The question shook her more than she expected because it carried no threat, no demand, just concern. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Just take me far from here." She didn't want to explain herself. She didn't want pity, and she didn't want him thinking she was weak. Dawson dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, and approached her with steady steps. Up close, he took in the stiffness in her posture, the trembling in her hands, the dried blood on her elbow from a fall, and the red marks across her shoulder where someone had grabbed her. He didn't pressure her to explain. He didn't question her shame. He simply released a quiet breath and held out his hand. "I'm not taking anything from you," he said. His tone was calm, certain, and carried no judgment. "You get on the horse. That's all." Sadie stared at his hand as if it were something foreign. She didn't know what to feel: relief, suspicion, or fear that he was pretending to be kind. Her legs wavered, and she breathed once through her nose before placing her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, her grip weak. Dawson guided her toward the mare with careful strength, lifting her in a steady motion and helping her settle onto the saddle. When she moved, the skirt pulled higher along her thigh, but he kept his eyes on the reins, never once lowering them to her exposed skin. She slid her arms around his waist because she had no other way to stay balanced, and the closeness sent a brief shiver through her that she hoped he didn't feel. Her inner thoughts moved too fast to control. He could hurt me. He could change his mind. He could hand me to someone else. But her body relaxed against his back despite her fear because something about his steadiness felt safe in a way she hadn't felt in months. Dawson swung back into the saddle in front of her. Her legs tightened around his hips to keep from slipping. He clicked his tongue lightly, and the mare started forward in a gentle pace. As they rode, Sadie pressed her forehead lightly against Dawson's back, partly from exhaustion and partly because she needed something solid to hold on to. Each of his breaths rose and fell in slow, steady rhythm, and the consistency settled her nerves more than anything he could have said. Dawson kept his eyes on the trail ahead, already adjusting his plans for the day. Taking her home meant changing his schedule, delaying fence repairs, and adding responsibility he hadn't expected, but he didn't question it. Leaving her on that road wasn't an option. He didn't know her story. She didn't know his. But both of them carried the same quiet truth inside their chests. Neither had anyone waiting for them. The mare carried them toward Dawson's homestead at a slow, steady trot, the sun lowering behind them as they left the empty road and stepped into a future neither of them imagined that morning. The sun had dropped lower by the time Dawson Hale and Sadie Grant reached the long stretch leading toward his property. The road widened slightly, and the dry grass around them shifted from pale yellow to a deeper shade as the evening cooled the ground. Sadie's arms remained around Dawson's waist, her fingers hooked lightly into the fabric of his shirt, not from trust, but because exhaustion made it impossible to sit upright without leaning on him. She had stopped trembling, yet her breath still caught sometimes whenever the horse stumbled or when Dawson shifted in the saddle. She didn't let herself relax fully, not with her mind still circling the same fear. Those men could still be behind us. Dawson knew she was tired from the way her head rested against his back, and he adjusted the mare's pace so the ride stayed smooth and steady. He didn't rush her, and he didn't speak. When he finally broke the silence, it was because the questions she hadn't answered lingered too loud in his mind. "They're not coming after you?" he asked without turning his head. "I don't know," she said quietly. "They had a wagon. I just ran. I didn't look back long enough to see if they followed." Her voice carried the strain of someone who had used every ounce of strength to survive, and Dawson didn't press her. He only nodded once, more to himself than to her, and kept guiding the mare forward until the land opened into a broad field bordered by a simple line of wooden posts. Sadie lifted her head enough to see the silhouette of a cabin in the distance, small, worn, and sitting near a lone cottonwood tree. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, the leftover sign of a fire Dawson had built that morning to heat water before leaving for the cattle run. Sadie studied the place with cautious hope. The cabin wasn't grand or hidden. It wasn't surrounded by neighbors or men who'd ask questions. It looked like a place a quiet man would choose when he wanted to stay far from trouble. "Is this yours?" she asked. "Yeah," Dawson answered. "Been living here 8 years." She watched the way his shoulders tightened slightly as he said it, as if those 8 years held losses he didn't talk about. Sadie didn't pry. She had been asked enough unwanted questions in her life to know when a person carried their own ghosts. They reached the cabin as the last of the daylight faded. Dawson stopped the mare near the porch, slid down, then turned to help her without hesitation. He placed one hand at her waist to steady her, and Sadie felt the controlled strength in his grip. She didn't flinch, but her heart gave a sharp thud in her chest because being touched without harm felt foreign. When her feet hit the ground, the cool dirt surprised her. She winced from the tenderness in her soles, and Dawson caught the way her jaw tightened. "Your hut's in," he said, looking down at her feet. "They took my shoes off," she explained, almost embarrassed. Said I'd run slower. Dawson released a long breath, not angry at her, but at the thought of anyone treating a woman like that. "You'll get cleaned up inside," he said. "I'll see what I got for your feet." He led her toward the cabin, not touching her again, just walking ahead at a pace she could keep up with. Sadie followed slowly, taking in the land around her. A fenced corral stood to the east with 2 horses grazing quietly. A small shed leaned slightly to one side from years of storms, and a pile of chopped firewood sat near the wall, showing Dawson's habit of preparing ahead for colder months. Inside the cabin, the air held the faint smell of smoke and pine. The space was orderly. Table, 2 chairs, a shelf with tools, a bed neatly made in the corner, a stove with leftover embers glowing faintly. Nothing about the place felt threatening. It looked like somewhere a man lived because he had nowhere else. Sadie stood near the doorway with her fingers gripping the torn edge of her dress again, unsure of where to step or what to say. "You can sit," Dawson said. He pointed toward the chair closest to the stove. "Warm yourself first." She lowered herself slowly, careful not to move too fast in the weakened state her body was in. The warmth from the stove eased into her arms and legs, and her breathing settled enough for her shoulders to drop a little. Dawson watched her a short moment, then moved around the cabin with practiced ease. He poured water from a tin pitcher into a basin, set it on the table, and checked the shelf for bandages. Sadie followed his movements, noticing how deliberate each action was. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. She wondered if he always lived like this, or if her presence had made him more cautious. "You ever lived on your own like this?" she asked, her voice soft, curious. "For a long time now," he said. "Had a brother once. He's gone." The words came out steady, but the tightening around his mouth revealed more than he intended. "I'm sorry," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss the comment either. Dawson brought the basin to her and set it on the table. "Wash your hands. Face too. I'll get you something to eat." Sadie dipped her hands into the cool water, and the dirt began to loosen from her skin. The moment felt almost startling. Clean water, a quiet room, a man who wasn't trying to take something from her. She blinked slowly, trying to steady the sudden wave of relief that made her throat tighten. She didn't cry. She refused to, not in front of him. But she exhaled with a sound she couldn't stop, and Dawson heard it. "They won't get near this place," he said, firm but calm. "Not while you're here." "Why help me?" she asked after a moment, her voice more honest this time. "You don't know me." He paused while cutting bread, holding the knife still for a few seconds. "Saw someone scared," he said simply. "Figured I wasn't going to ride past it." Sadie didn't know what to say. Not many men she had met lived by rules like that. She looked down at her hands and felt something shift inside her, something like the first step towards safety, even if she didn't fully trust it yet. Dawson placed the bread and a small piece of salted pork on a plate and set it before her. She ate slowly, not wanting to appear desperate, even though hunger clawed at her stomach. Dawson sat across from her, watching the window, checking the fading light outside. "You'll stay tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, We'll talk about what comes next. What if those men come looking for me? She asked, unable to hide her fear. Let him try, Dawson said without raising his voice. They ain't taking you off this land. The way he said it, calm, grounded, certain, pulled a faint, unfamiliar warmth through her chest. For the first time since she escaped, she felt her breath deepen enough to stop shaking. Outside, night settled over the ranch, the sky turning dark blue above the quiet fields. Sadie finished the last bite of bread, wiped her hands, and lifted her eyes toward the man who had changed the course of her day with one simple decision. She didn't know yet what she meant to him. He didn't know yet what she would become in his life. But the door had closed behind them, and neither felt alone tonight. The last light slipped behind the ridge as Sadie Grant finished eating, and the room settled into a quiet that made every small sound clearer. The faint hiss of the stove's remaining embers, the creak of the cabin's walls adjusting to the cooler air, the soft scrape of Dawson Hale moving his chair so it didn't block her path. Sadie watched him as he set the plate aside. He didn't hover, didn't question her further, and didn't show discomfort at having someone new in his home. If anything, he seemed to move with a careful steadiness, as though he didn't want to overwhelm her after what she had been through. She looked down at her torn dress, noticing the dirt that still clung to her collarbone and the faint bruise forming beneath the ragged neckline. She tried to pull the fabric together again, but it had stretched too far, and the movement only exposed another mark along her chest from where one of the men had grabbed her. Dawson turned toward the shelf near his bed and took down a folded blanket. I'll get the wash water warmed, he said. You can clean up proper. Sadie blinked in surprise. Why were you being so mindful? She asked before she could stop herself. Men ain't usually like this. I ain't most men, Dawson replied without looking back. That answer eased something inside her. Not trust yet, but the sense that she wasn't misreading him. Dawson wasn't ignoring what happened to her. He simply wasn't treating her like a burden or an opportunity. He was giving her room to breathe. Dawson took the kettle from the stove and stepped outside to gather more water from the barrel. Sadie watched him through the open doorway, noticing details she hadn't paid attention to earlier. The limp in his left leg appeared only when he walked uphill. The scars along his forearm showed he'd known violence before. The way he lifted the heavy kettle with one hand revealed strength that didn't need boasting. She wondered what had happened to him 8 years ago that drove him to live alone on this stretch of land. Inside, she studied the cabin with clearer eyes now that her panic had eased. She saw how Dawson arranged everything with practical order. Tools hung in straight lines, extra rope coiled neatly, a rifle placed within reach but not displayed like a threat. His bed sat in the far corner, blankets tucked tight with a single pillow worn thin. The other half of the room looked unused, like no one else had slept or eaten here in years. Sadie swallowed. You really live alone out here? For a long while, Dawson said, setting the kettle back onto the stove. Had company once. Lost it. Didn't want more trouble following me. That statement revealed more than he intended. Loss, regret, and a past that shaped him into the quiet figure she now relied on. She didn't ask further. She sensed he wouldn't tell her tonight. When the water warmed, Dawson poured it into a wooden basin and stepped back. It ain't much, but it'll wash the dirt off, he said. You sure you're all right with me using it? Sadie asked, her voice low. It's here to be used, he answered. You go ahead. Sadie dipped the cloth into the warm water, wringing it gently. She wiped her arms first, then her neck, then her face, finally letting out a small sigh at the feeling of warmth replacing the day's dust and fear. She cleaned the dirt from her collarbone and paused when she reached the exposed skin across her chest. She could feel Dawson's presence behind her, not watching her body, but making sure she wasn't struggling. You need a shirt, he said. There's one in that drawer. It'll fit loose, but it'll cover you. She hesitated only a second before opening the drawer. Inside lay folded clothing, all clean and neatly placed. She found a shirt that looked worn but soft and held it close. The fabric smelled faintly of soap and smoke. She turned away from him and slipped out of her torn dress, keeping her back to him as she pulled the shirt over her head. It hung down to her thighs, the sleeves too long, but the way it covered her made her exhale with relief she didn't hide. Dawson didn't comment on how she looked. He only said, "You'll sleep better without that torn thing." Sadie folded her dress and set it aside. "Why were you helping me this much?" she asked, eyes steady now. "Not just the ride, not just the food. All of it." He finally met her gaze without looking away. "Because you showed up hurt and scared," he said. "And because I gotta say in what kind of man I choose to be." The answer hit her hard. Not romantically, not dramatically, but with a simple honesty she wasn't used to hearing. She nodded once and sat back in the chair, letting the warmth of the stove settle into her body. Dawson checked the window again, scanning the dark field for anything unusual. Sadie noticed the tension in his shoulders and realized what she hadn't asked until now. "Dawson," she said quietly, "you don't think they followed me, do you?" He kept his eyes on the darkness. "I didn't see tracks near the ridge, but men like that don't give up easy." He turned toward her. "They'll try to track the road, but they'll stop when they see where it leads." "Why?" she asked. "Because they know who lives here," Dawson replied. "And they won't want what comes with walking onto this land uninvited." Sadie stared at him, realizing something she hadn't known. Dawson wasn't just a quiet ranch hand. He had a reputation, one built from whatever fight he survived years ago. She didn't know the story, but she understood the effect. A dangerous man doesn't need to boast. The land carries his name for him. A sudden wind swept against the cabin, and the small window rattled gently. Sadie flinched before catching herself. Dawson noticed, walked to the window, and secured the latch. "You're inside now," he said calmly. "You ain't out on the trail no more." Sadie studied him as he returned to the table. His face wasn't cold, just worn, like someone who had spent years expecting the worst, so he wouldn't be surprised when it came. Her heartbeat slowed, but her mind kept circling one question she couldn't hold back any longer. "Dawson, if those men do come here, what'll you do?" He didn't break eye contact. "Whatever's needed." There was no threat in his tone, only certainty. She nodded slowly, feeling something settle deeper inside her chest. Fear still there, but steadier now because someone else was finally standing between her and danger. Dawson moved toward the unlit lantern on the shelf. "You take the bed tonight. I'll stay near the door." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. He lit the lantern, dimming it so the room filled with a soft glow. The light fell across Sadie's face, showing the growing calm in her features, the exhaustion she had fought for hours, and the hint of trust she didn't want to admit yet. She climbed into the bed slowly, still wearing a shirt, pulling the blanket over herself with careful movements. When she settled in, she looked smaller but not fragile, more like someone who had survived enough to recognize when safety was real. Dawson sat in the chair near the door, rifle propped against his leg, posture upright enough to stay awake. Sadie watched him for a moment, memorizing the quiet strength she saw there. "Good night," she said softly. "Rest," Dawson replied. Sadie closed her eyes. The cabin fell silent again, but this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt guarded. It felt alive. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. But both needed more than they could admit. And outside, the night held steady over the lonely ranch, unaware that two wounded lives had just shifted onto the same path. Dawn broke with a pale gray light that slipped through the cabin's single window and stretched across the wooden floorboards, casting a faint outline around Dawson Hale, who had spent the night sitting upright in the chair near the door. His rifle rested against his leg, his hat tilted forward slightly, and his posture was steady enough that anyone glancing in might think he had slept fully alert. He hadn't. He drifted in short fragments of rest, his ears tuned to any sound outside the cabin that didn't belong to the normal rhythm of the plains. But nothing came except the low call of a distant bird and the soft groan of the wind crossing the open field. Sadie Grant stirred in the bed behind him, the blanket shifting as she slowly sat up. Dawson didn't turn. He waited until she spoke. "You didn't sleep," she said, her voice soft, still carrying the rasp of someone who cried earlier and tried to hide it. "I slept enough," he replied, lifting his head. Sadie pulled the blanket around herself, the oversized shirt Dawson had given her brushing against her knees. She blinked at the soft morning light and tried to gather her thoughts. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, but when she saw Dawson by the door, the memory settled. Yesterday's panic, the ride, the basin of warm water, the clean shirt, the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Her eyes drifted toward the window, half expecting to see figures in the yard. "You think they came through the night?" she asked. Dawson finally turned toward her. "If they did, they stayed far from the house." "I would have known." Sadie wasn't convinced. Men like the one she fled didn't always announce themselves. She pulled her legs up slightly, feeling the soreness along her feet and shins. She looked toward Dawson. "Those men, they said they worked for someone. A foreman at the mine, I think. Someone who didn't care how they got women there, long as they filled the wagon. What kind of man does a job like that?" "The kind that don't think they'll ever be stopped," Dawson said flatly. He stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his leg before moving to light the stove. The simple act filled the room with a low crackling sound and a faint smell of smoke. Sadie watched him as he moved. He didn't rush, didn't speak unnecessarily, and didn't avoid her eyes. "I never thanked you," she finally said. "You don't owe me that," he answered while placing the pan on the stove. "That's not what I meant." She hesitated. "You treated me better than anyone had in a long time." Dawson didn't respond, but the brief pause in his movements showed he heard her. As the fire warmed the pan, Sadie decided on a question that had stayed in her mind since the night before, something she knew listeners would wonder about as much as she did. "Why were you on that trail yesterday?" she asked. Dawson cracked an egg into the pan. "Delivered cattle in pine brush. Always take the long road home." "That can't be the only reason," she said, studying him. "Most men stick to town roads. They don't ride the lonely stretches unless they're avoiding something." He glanced over his shoulder. "You always this straightforward?" She shrugged slightly. "Life taught me to stop guessing." He slid the eggs in the pan. "Fair enough. I take that trail because it's quiet, because no one bothers me out there, and because the other road near the canyon." He paused, jaw tightening. "I lost someone on that stretch. Don't ride it anymore." Sadie nodded slowly, absorbing the new information. Dawson hadn't told her everything. She could see that clearly, but the way he said "lost someone" carried a weight she didn't push against. She understood grief that lived more in silence than in words. Dawson moved around the stove, set bread to warm, and placed 2 tin plates on the table. When he finished, he stepped back, giving her space. "Come eat," he said. Sadie approached the table carefully, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. She sat down and took a small bite first, testing whether her stomach could handle food after yesterday's fear. The warmth of the eggs steadied her, and she ate with slow, grateful movements. Dawson sat across from her, eating quietly. She cleared her throat. "You asked yesterday if I thought they followed me. I didn't answer fully." "Answer now," Dawson said. "I don't think they were just 2 drunk men acting on their own. They talked like they had orders, like someone pays them to bring women back." Dawson's jaw flexed. "Somebody's making business out of fear." Sadie nodded. "They said the foreman didn't ask how women got there, just that they arrive. They don't care what happens on the road." Dawson leaned back, his expression hardening. "That foreman got a name?" "I only heard Miller," she said. "They said he'll send another wagon soon." Dawson absorbed this quietly. The mine was a long ride from here, farther than most ranchers care to travel, but rumors had floated through the territory for months about labor being forced into the camps. If what Sadie said was true, this wasn't an isolated attack. He looked at her, expression steady. "You ain't going back near that mining road." "Wasn't planning on it," she said. They finished eating, and Dawson stood to clean the plates. Sadie took that moment to ask another question she had held back. "What about me?" she asked. "What happens now?" Dawson rinsed the plates in the basin before answering. "First, I check the land. Make sure no one stepped near the fence line. Then we talk about where you can stay long-term." "Long-term," she repeated. "You ain't walking out of here until you're strong enough. And you ain't leaving if those men are anywhere close. Not until we know you're safe." His certainty caught her off guard. No man had ever spoken about her safety like it mattered. She swallowed. "And after that, that's up to you," he said. Sadie watched him carefully as he stepped outside, the door creaking behind him. She stood, walked to the window, and peeked out. Dawson moved with a strong but cautious stride, scanning the fields and checking the ground for tracks. Sadie pressed her hand lightly to the window frame. Her mind circled new questions, questions she had been too afraid to consider until now. Dawson wasn't a man who lived halfway. He made choices with calm certainty. If he planned to keep her safe, he would do it with everything he had. And yet she knew one thing for certain. Men like the one she escaped wouldn't forget her. They wouldn't let go of what they considered theirs. They'd come eventually. The only unknown was when. When Dawson returned to the cabin a few minutes later, dust on his boots, Sadie faced him. "Did you see anything?" she asked. He shook his head once. "No tracks close by, but we're not talking chances." She stepped closer. "What do you want me to do?" "You stay inside for now," he said, "and you stick close. If trouble shows itself, you let me deal with it." Sadie nodded, but her voice was steady when she spoke again. "What if I want to help?" He studied her a long moment. "We'll figure that out when we need to." The morning settled fully around them, and for the first time since she arrived, Sadie felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: control over her own future. Dawson shifted his weight, watching her with a look she couldn't quite name. "We're not done talking, Sadie," he said, "and there's more I need to know." Whatever came next, neither of them stood alone anymore. The sun had climbed a little higher by the time Dawson Hale stepped back inside the cabin after checking the land, and Sadie Grant was still standing near the window, her fingers resting lightly against the wooden frame as though grounding herself before the day started. She turned when the door closed, searching his expression for any sign of danger he might have noticed outside. Dawson gave a short shake of his head, not dismissive but certain enough to ease the knot in her stomach. "Fence line's clear," he said. "No tracks close enough to worry us yet." "Yet," she repeated quietly, catching the careful way he had phrased it. "We plan ahead," Dawson said. "Not out of fear, just caution." Sadie nodded. She had lived enough life to understand that yet didn't mean safety. It meant time. Time to prepare, time to think, time to rebuild pieces of herself she had been forced to bury. Dawson rested the rifle against the wall and set his hat on a hook. He glanced at her bare feet, still tender from walking miles along the road. "We'll get you boots today," he said. "I bought an old pair from my sister. Might fit if we stuff the toes." That answer stopped her short. Not the boots, but the unexpected detail. "You had a sister?" "Have," he corrected. "But she don't live anywhere near here." Sadie waited, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "She left after our father died," he continued. "Didn't want this life. Didn't want the quiet or the work or the reminders." Sadie's eyes shifted slightly, absorbing the new information. The listeners would have wondered about it. Why a man like Dawson lived alone for 8 years, what had pushed his remaining family away, and why he stayed when she didn't. "So why did you stay?" Sadie asked gently. Dawson shrugged once, not out of indifference, but because answers came hard to a man who rarely voiced his own reasoning. "I'm not much good anywhere else," he said. "This land, I know it. It don't demand talking. It just needs work." He paused, and I guess I needed that more than anything. Sadie understood that better than she expected. Silence could be a punishment, but it could also be a place to hide when the world felt too loud. Dawson looked toward the door again, not because he expected trouble, but because he always anticipated the worst before relaxing. "If you feel up to it," he said, "you can help with some small things out back. Gives you something to do besides think." Sadie gave a faint half-smile. "You don't strike me as the kind who lets strangers help on your land." "You're not a stranger anymore," Dawson said simply. The words hit her unexpectedly, landing somewhere deep in her chest. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, steadied her voice, and nodded. "All right, just tell me what you need." Dawson retrieved a pair of socks from a drawer and set them on the table. "Start with these. I'll check the shed." Sadie slid into the socks carefully, wincing only once as the fabric pressed against the tender spots on her feet. The warmth helped, and the simple gesture, him giving up the last pair of decent socks he owned, felt bigger than she wanted to admit. She followed him outside moments later, stepping into the bright morning light. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth, old wood, and the faint lingering smoke from the chimney. Dawson was already at the shed door, opening it with a slow push that made the hinges groan. Inside, the shed was cluttered with tools, rope, a broken saddle, and two large crates pushed into the corner. Sadie stepped in behind him, breathing in the smell of dust and weathered leather. "You'll find boots in that crate," Dawson said, pointing to the one nearest her. "Look through 'em. Pick whatever feels closest." Sadie crouched and opened the crate. Inside were items she hadn't expected: women's clothing, a shawl, a battered pair of boots small enough to fit her, and a faded ribbon folded in the corner. She looked up at him sharply. "You said your sister left," she said carefully. "Why'd she leave her things?" Dawson's shoulders tightened. "She left quick," he said. "Didn't want to stay long enough to pack." Sadie didn't push the subject, but the answer created a new understanding. His sister hadn't drifted away over time. She had fled something painful. Something Dawson didn't want to say out loud. Perhaps he blamed himself. Perhaps he had good reason to. Whatever the story was, it shaped why he kept his distance from folks, why he protected Sadie without question, and why he kept this land the way another man might keep a grave marker. Simple, quiet, and unchanged. Sadie lifted the boots, tested the weight, and slid one on. It was slightly too large, but not enough to cause trouble. "This'll work," she said. Dawson nodded. "Let's get to the chores." They stepped out of the shed and walked into the yard, the morning brightening into clear blue overhead. Dawson handed her a small bucket. "Fill this at the barrel, carry it to the trough." Sadie braced herself. She had done farm work before at her uncle's ranch years ago. She filled the bucket, water sloshing lightly against her leg, and walked it across the yard with steady breaths. Dawson watched her, gauging her strength without making her feel judged. "You handle work better than most," he said. "Hard work ain't new to me," she answered. "Good," he said. "You'll fit fine here." That comment made her pause. "Fit here for how long?" "As long as you need," Dawson replied. Sadie lowered the bucket into the trough, listening to the splash. "You don't even know if I'm trouble." "I know what trouble looks like," Dawson said. "You're not that." Sadie looked at him closely, trying to read whatever he wasn't saying. His eyes held a tension that didn't match the calm tone in his voice. "You think those men were hired to take more women?" she asked suddenly. "Yes," Dawson said, "and I think they've done it before." Sadie's breath caught. "Then it won't end with me." "Probably not," he said, "but we'll deal with that when it comes." "What do you mean we?" she asked. Dawson crossed his arms, studying her with a steady gaze. "You're on my land now. What comes for you comes through me." Sadie felt her throat tighten. Not fear, something else. She wasn't used to someone drawing a line in front of her instead of behind her. Dawson stepped past her toward the barn. "There's another thing we need to talk about," he said. "You didn't run that far in those torn clothes without someone else seeing you. If the men you escaped spoke to anybody in Pine Brush, folks might know you're gone." "You think the town's involved?" she asked, shocked. "I think someone saw you get dragged and didn't step in." Sadie swallowed hard. "That's almost worse." "It is," Dawson agreed. "But it also means we can't rely on the town if we need help." "Then who do we rely on?" she whispered. "Each other," Dawson said. Sadie felt heat rising behind her eyes, but blinked it away. She didn't want tears, not now. Not when the first sense of belonging she'd felt in months was forming slowly, like the first warmth in winter after a long freeze. He opened the barn door and motioned for her to follow. Inside, the light filtered through gaps in the old boards and fell over stacks of hay, the saddle rack, tools lined neatly against the far wall, and the two horses, his mare and a younger gelding, who lifted their heads as the door creaked. "Your new job," Dawson said, "is feed in them each morning. They're like steady hands." Sadie reached for the hay, her fingers brushing the rough, dried grass. Her mind replayed Dawson's words, "each other." The meaning sank deeper than she expected. "Dawson," she said quietly. He looked over. "When you found me on that road, did you have any doubt about taking me with you?" "No," he answered. "Only doubts I had were about what hurt you and how much I needed to do to fix it." Sadie didn't look away. "Why?" He studied her for a long moment, then finally said, "Because everyone deserves someone standing between them and the worst parts of the world." Sadie exhaled, steady and slow. The morning work continued, but something unspoken had changed between them, something that neither of them tried to name yet, but both felt in the space where silence settled. The day had only begun, but the bond that formed between a woman running for her life and a man who lived like he had nothing left to offer was already shifting into something deeper, something that would soon be tested. By late afternoon, the Wyoming light stretched wide across the ranch, flattening the shadows and warming the dry earth as Sadie Grant and Dawson Hale worked side by side in a rhythm that formed naturally despite the fact they had known each other barely a day. Sadie carried small bundles of hay to the trough, shifting her weight carefully in the borrowed boots that still rubbed her heels, while Dawson reinforced the barn latch and checked the hinges along the corral gate. Nothing between them felt forced. They didn't fill the quiet with unnecessary talk, yet neither felt alone in the silence. When Dawson finished hammering the last nail into place, he glanced toward the ridge beyond the fence line. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Sadie noticed immediately and walked closer. "What is it?" "Thought I saw a flicker of movement up there," he said. "Could have been nothing." Sadie followed his gaze. The ridge looked still, a stretch of uneven rock and scattered brush. "You think someone's watching?" "Riders sometimes cut across that part of the land," Dawson said. "But anyone decent stays on the main trail. Folks crossing this close aren't coming by accident." Sadie's stomach tightened. The thought that someone might be tracking her made her hands tremble slightly, but she forced them still. If it's them, they're learning the land. Dawson didn't deny it. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Could be scouts from a mine," he said. "Could be someone looking for weak spots." "Are there weak spots?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said, his tone steady. "I fixed them this morning." Sadie studied him carefully. Dawson had a habit of underplaying danger, not because he wanted to mislead her, but because he didn't want her fear to guide her decisions. She appreciated the intent, but needed the truth to understand her own place in whatever was unfolding. "Dawson," she whispered, "they won't stop if they know I'm here." He stepped closer, not touching her, but standing near enough that she felt his presence cut through the anxiety pressing into her chest. "Let him come if they want," he said. "They'll find more than they bargained for." Sadie believed him, but that didn't remove the questions lingering in her mind. The listeners would be wondering too, why Dawson lived alone, what violence had shaped him, and what exactly had happened on that canyon road he refused to ride anymore. She waited for him to walk toward the barn before following, choosing her moment carefully. Inside the barn, the light filtered through the roof boards, softening the edges of the cluttered space. Dawson adjusted a saddle on the rack while Sadie brushed the mare's coat, letting the rhythm calm her breathing. When the mare nudged Sadie's shoulder with a gentle snort, Sadie smiled slightly before glancing back at Dawson. "Back on the trail," she said quietly. "You told me you lost someone. You didn't say who." Dawson froze for half a second, small but noticeable to someone watching closely. He set the saddle down, leaned his hand against the wooden beam, and breathed once through his nose. "My brother," he said. Sadie waited. "He wasn't just kin," Dawson continued. "He was the only person I had left after our father died. We ran cattle together, rode trails together, fought side by side whenever trouble came." Dawson's jaw tightened. "One day, near the canyon pass, we were ambushed. 3 men wanted our horses. We fought, but one of them fired a shotgun. Eli took the hit. His voice didn't crack, but the strain ran under every word. I dragged him off that road, tried to get him home. He didn't make it." Sadie's throat tightened. "And the men?" "Gone," Dawson said. "By the time I got Eli out of there." He looked away. "Folks said I should have chased them, brought them in, but I stayed with him instead." "You chose your brother," Sadie said softly. "I chose wrong," Dawson answered. Sadie stepped closer, lowering the brush. "No, you didn't." He looked at her then, really looked, as if weighing whether to let her words sink in or push them aside. Sadie didn't flinch from his gaze. "He wouldn't have wanted you to die trying to hunt them down," she said. "He'd have wanted you to stay alive." Dawson didn't speak, but something in his expression softened, just slightly, but enough for Sadie to see he let her words reach him. Before either could continue, the mare's ears shot up sharply. Then the gelding in the next stall lifted his head too, nostrils flaring. Sadie stiffened. "What does that mean?" "Means something's close," Dawson said. He walked to the barn door quietly and lifted the latch. Sadie followed behind him, her pulse quickening. Dawson stepped out first, scanning the ridge, the fields, and the tree line with practiced precision. Sadie held her breath. A single rider stood far off, barely more than a silhouette against the horizon, still watching, unmoving. "Is that one of them?" Sadie whispered. "Can't tell from here," Dawson said. "But he knows he's seen." The rider lingered for a long moment before turning his horse and disappearing behind the ridge. Sadie grabbed Dawson's arm, not out of panic, but out of instinct. Why didn't he come closer? Because he wanted to learn something, Dawson said. Not start a fight. What would he have learned? That you're alive, he said, and you're not alone. Sadie swallowed hard. Fear trembled through her, but something else rose alongside it. Anger. For months she had been running, hiding, shrinking herself so she wouldn't be noticed. Standing beside Dawson, watching that figure disappear, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. "We can't wait," she said quietly. "We can't pretend they won't come back." "I know," Dawson said. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We prepare," Dawson answered. "And you stay where I can see you." Sadie didn't argue. She understood. Even if the words carried an intimacy she wasn't prepared for. She stepped back into the barn with him, her mind racing through the questions she had tried to ignore earlier. "Dawson," she said, "if this turns into a fight, what happens to me?" "You survive," he said without hesitation. "And you?" she pushed. He paused, just long enough for her to catch it. "I'll be fine," he said. "Been through worse." Sadie didn't believe that entirely, but she didn't press him. The weight in his tone held the truth. He had already decided he'd take the first blow if it came to that. They finished the barn work in silence, both moving more carefully now, like people expecting a warning at any moment. When Dawson closed the barn door, Sadie stepped beside him. "You didn't ask what I lost," she said. Back at the table. "You asked about the men, but not about everything before." "Didn't want to push," Dawson said. "Ask me now," Sadie whispered. Dawson turned fully toward her, waiting. Sadie steadied her breath. "My mother died when I was 17. My uncle took me in, but he wasn't kind. He wanted me married off to one of his friends, a man older than him. I ran. I went from place to place, doing whatever I could to stay alive. Half the time, I didn't choose where I ended up. That mining wagon was just the latest place I was trapped." Dawson's expression didn't change, but a deep understanding settled between them. A human recognition of two different pain paths intersecting at the same fragile moment. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer comfort she didn't ask for. He simply stood there with her, steady and present. "Sadie," he said quietly, "nothing that happened before decides what you get now." She blinked, breath catching. "And what do I get now?" she asked. "A chance," Dawson said. "A place that ain't trying to break you." Sadie looked at him, the barn quiet behind them, the sun lowering across the open land. She felt something shift inside her, small, careful, but real. Dawson stepped past her toward the cabin. "Come on," he said. "We need to talk about defenses." She followed, but her mind didn't focus on defenses first. Her mind focused on him, the man who kept choosing to stand between her and the darkness she thought she'd never escape. And for the first time since she arrived, she wondered whether staying here wasn't just survival. Maybe it was the beginning of belonging. By the time Dawson Hale and Sadie Grant stepped back inside the cabin, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the horizon in dull orange, leaving the land in a strange half-light that made every shadow look sharper. Dawson shut the door firmly, checked the latch twice, and moved to the window with the same watchful attention he had shown earlier. Sadie stood near the table, her arms folded lightly across her middle as she waited for him to speak. "What did that rider want?" she asked. "Scouting," Dawson answered, pulling the curtain halfway. He wasn't guessing. He was confirming. "Someone told him to ride this way." "Then they are looking for me," she whispered. "Yes," Dawson said, turning to face her. "And they know where you are now." Sadie swallowed hard. Fear passed through her quickly, then settled into something steadier. "How long do you think until they come?" "Could be tonight," Dawson said. "Could be 2 days. Depends on how many they got." He paused. "Depends on how scared they are of riding onto my land." Sadie stepped closer. "Why would they be scared? You're one man. Dawson didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the shelf near his bed and pulled down a heavy wooden box she hadn't noticed earlier. He set it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were two revolvers, oiled and well-maintained, and a small box of ammunition. Sadie stared at the weapons, the realization hitting her that Dawson had prepared long before she ever arrived. "You were expecting trouble?" she asked. "No," Dawson said as he checked the cylinder of the first gun. "But trouble's visited me enough times that I learned to keep things ready." Sadie studied the quiet way he loaded the revolver, the practiced method of someone who didn't want to fight but had survived enough fights to take them seriously. A question formed in her mind, one listeners would wonder too, and she asked it before she could overthink it. "You ever kill a man?" Dawson's hands stopped just long enough to show the answer was not simple. "I didn't want to," he said, "but I have." Sadie waited for more. "Years back," he continued, "before Eli died, we fought off rustlers near the canyon. They didn't plan on leaving witnesses. We didn't plan on dying. One didn't walk away." Sadie exhaled slowly. The revelation didn't frighten her as much as she thought it would. If anything, it clarified the quiet depth inside him. The way he moved, the way he watched the ridge, the way he didn't talk about danger unless it was real. "And if they come here," she asked. "I'll do what needs doing," Dawson said. Sadie lowered her gaze, understanding the reality of his promise. This wasn't about heroics. It was survival, pure and unromantic, shaped by a harsh land and harder experiences. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. Dawson didn't expect that answer. He straightened slightly, studying her face as if testing whether she was speaking from fear or resolve. When he saw neither wavering nor panic in her eyes, he nodded. "You stay behind me," he said. "You don't run outside unless I tell you. And you don't pick up a gun unless you absolutely have to." Sadie stepped closer. "If you get hurt." "I won't," he cut in. "You can't know that." "I can handle it," he said. Sadie wasn't satisfied. "If they come, I'm not hiding in a corner pretending I don't exist." Dawson looked at her with a firmness that wasn't anger, but something bordering on protectiveness that ran deeper than she expected. "If something happens to me," he said quietly, "you take the second gun. You get on my mare. You ride east toward the creek. You don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered. "You will if you have to," he insisted. Sadie lifted her chin. "No, I won't." The room went still. Dawson's jaw tightened, not out of frustration, but from something he struggled to voice. He turned away first, the smallest sign that her refusal had struck deeper than he intended to show. "We'll talk about that later," he muttered. Sadie didn't push further. Instead, she moved to the stove and added wood to the dying fire, letting the warmth fill the cabin again. She tried to steady her breathing, but thoughts kept circling. What the rider had seen, when the men might return, whether Dawson's past would catch up with them faster than they expected. While she worked, Dawson stepped outside again to check the yard one last time. Sadie followed after a moment, stopping on the porch. She noticed that Dawson didn't just look for riders. He counted distances, tested the ground with his boot, and mentally mapped out where he'd stand if he needed cover. She watched his careful, quiet preparation and felt something she didn't expect, a strange sense of safety rather than fear. "Dawson," she called softly. He turned, the last of the daylight catching the side of his face. "You said earlier, nothing that happened before decides what I get now." She paused. "What do you get now?" For the first time, Dawson hesitated, not a pause of caution, but of honesty. "I don't know," he said. "Didn't think that far ahead." Sadie descended the porch steps and walked toward him slowly, stopping only a foot away. "Maybe you should." Dawson's throat worked as he swallowed. The air between them changed. Not heavy, not rushed, but aware. Sadie didn't reach for him, but she stepped close enough that he could feel the steady warmth of her breath. "You think I'll pay me ends when those men stop coming?" she asked. "I don't know what comes next," Dawson admitted. "Then learn," she said quietly. He exhaled sharply, not irritated, overwhelmed. No woman had spoken to him like that in years, not with challenge, not with sincerity. As the last line of sunlight faded behind the ridge, Sadie reached out and lightly touched Dawson's arm. Her fingers were soft, the gesture brief, but it sent a jolt through him all the same. "I trust you," she whispered. More than I thought I could trust anyone again. Dawson didn't step back. He didn't shut down. Instead, he placed his hand over hers with deliberate gentleness, his rough palm warm against her skin. You're safe here, he said, voice low. Sadie met his eyes. Not just safe. Seen. That broke something open in him he wasn't ready for. But instead of pulling away, Dawson leaned closer, slow, breath measured, giving her every chance to move. She didn't. Her hand lifted slightly, brushing his shirt at the collar. Their lips met, soft, tentative, slow, and the world around them disappeared into the quiet hum of shared breath and the faint stir of wind across the yard. Dawson's hand moved to the side of her waist, steadying her as if afraid she'd sway. Sadie leaned into him with a fragile certainty she hadn't felt since childhood, her heart pounding in a rhythm she couldn't control. When they finally pulled back, neither spoke at first. Sadie's voice trembled when she whispered, "What now?" Dawson looked toward the ridge, then back at her. "Now," he said, "we get ready." Their moment wasn't overpowered by fear, it was shaped by it. Two wounded people standing in the dusk, choosing closeness despite the danger, crawling closer from the ridge. And though neither said it out loud, they both understood the same truth. Something had changed between them. Something that no threat, no mining foreman, and no rider on the ridge could undo. Night settled fully across the Wyoming plain, the darkness thick enough that the ridge to the west disappeared into a single black line. Dawson Hale stood outside the cabin with a lantern lowered to half light. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to see Sadie Grant's face as she stepped out behind him. The warmth from their kiss still lingered between them, quiet and steady, but neither spoke of it now. Both understood the moment had shifted naturally into something heavier, something approaching fast from the ridge. Sadie wrapped Dawson's shirt tighter around herself, her breath forming a faint cloud in the cooling air. "Do you want me inside?" she asked. "I want you close," Dawson said, scanning the land with slow precision. "But not in the open if things turn bad." Sadie didn't argue. She knew better than to downplay danger. Instead, she stepped to the porch railing and looked out over the field. The silence felt too deep, too purposeful, like the land was holding its breath. "What did you see earlier when the rider left?" Sadie asked. "A signal," Dawson said. "He wasn't looking for us alone. He was marking the trail so others could follow without making noise." Sadie's pulse jumped. "You think they're coming tonight?" "I think they're already moving," Dawson said. "Folks trained to drag women into wagons know how to travel quiet." Sadie gripped the railing. "Where will they come from?" "They'll try for the east tree line," Dawson answered. "More cover. Less open ground." Sadie nodded, her mind working, piecing together the land she had seen earlier. "What about the creek bed?" "It dips low. Someone could crawl along it until they're near the barn." Dawson turned his head slowly toward her. "You catch on fast." "I've been hunted before," she said. He didn't like hearing that, but he didn't dismiss her insight either. "Then you know we can't leave that low ground unchecked," he said. "If they're smart, and I think they are, they'll come from two sides. One to distract, one to snatch." Sadie's breath tightened. "Snatch me." "Not while I'm breathing," Dawson said. Sadie walked down the porch steps, closing the space between them. She wasn't shaking now. The fear from Chapter 1, the helpless fear, had changed into a sharper, more controlled tension. "Dawson," she said, "if you're right, we need to be ready before they reach the fence." "I know," he said. "So what's the plan?" Dawson motioned for her to follow. They crossed the yard quietly, the dirt crunching faintly under their boots until they reached the shed. Dawson pushed the door open and pulled out a heavy wooden beam he'd been meaning to reinforce the barn with. He set it against the main gate's latch. "This will hold the horses' stalls," he said. "If they make noise or get spooked, we'll know before anyone reaches the cabin." Sadie nodded. "What about the house?" "We'll block the windows from the inside," Dawson said. "They can shoot through glass, but they can't see well if the lantern's low." Dawson opened another box, this one containing rope, nails, and a small metal canister. Sadie frowned. "What's that?" "Gunpowder," Dawson said. Her eyes widened. "You planning on blowing something up?" "No," he said. "But if they corner us, I'd rather blind him than let him drag you outside." The seriousness of that hit hard. Sadie didn't respond for a few seconds. She searched his face for hesitation and found none. "Dawson," she whispered, "you're willing to kill for me." He met her eyes. "I'm willing to protect you. Whatever that takes." Sadie felt her chest tighten, not in fear, but in a raw emotional ache that had been building since she first saw him on the road. Before she could speak, the gelding inside the barn snorted and stomped once, an unmistakable warning sign. Dawson froze. Sadie's breath halted. The gelding stomped again, louder. Dawson set the lantern on the ground and grabbed his rifle. Inside, he whispered. Sadie didn't move. "Tell me what you see." "Not what?" "Who?" Dawson said. Sadie's heartbeat roared in her ears. Dawson crouched low and moved along the side of the barn, keeping himself in shadow. Sadie followed silently, her hand brushing the side of the building for balance. They reached the edge and peeked around. A figure moved near the creek bed, slow, low to the ground, head ducked beneath the reeds. The person crawled forward, inch by inch, circling the property. Sadie's stomach dropped. "That's not the rider we saw." "No," Dawson whispered. "This one's smaller. Faster. Scouting the barn first." Sadie's voice trembled, but not from panic. "There'll be others behind him." "Yes," Dawson said. "Probably waiting to know where you sleep." Sadie's jaw clenched. "They think I'm easy to take." Dawson shifted his weight. "Let's prove them wrong." Before Sadie could answer, another shape appeared along the ridge, taller, broader, on horseback. Then another. The faint clink of metal drifted through the air. Sadie grabbed Dawson's sleeve. "How many do you think?" "3 at least," Dawson said. "Maybe 4. Sadie's chest tightened with a breath she forced steady. "Can you take him?" "With you on my back," he said, "I can take whoever steps on my land." The words landed like an anchor, steadying, grounding, fierce. Sadie exhaled. "Tell me what you need." Dawson turned to her, eyes sharp and sincere. "Stay near the cabin. Don't run unless I tell you. And if anyone gets close—" "I fight," she said. He didn't argue. But as Dawson started forward, Sadie caught his wrist. He turned, expecting fear, but found something else entirely. "Dawson," she whispered, "come back." The simple plea hit him harder than any threat on the ridge. He cupped the side of her face with a brief but steady touch. "I plan to." Sadie leaned into that touch. Not shy, not unsure, just honest. She pressed her lips softly against his cheek, the kind of kiss that carried more promise than fear. Then Dawson released her hand and stepped forward into the dark yard, rifle raised, shoulders squared, ready to face whatever came from the ridge. Sadie watched him go, her pulse shaking but her resolve firm. She wasn't running anymore. Not from her past. Not from a man searching for her. Not from a future building between her and Dawson Hale. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers stepped out of the dark, she would face it with him. For the first time since she was a girl, she finally knew where she belonged. The darkness around Dawson Hale's ranch thickened until the sky turned into one unbroken sheet of black, the kind that swallowed distance and made every breath sound louder than it should. Sadie Grant stood at the edge of the porch with her hand lightly resting on the doorframe. Her eyes locked on Dawson as he moved across the yard with steady, deliberate steps. He didn't crouch or creep. He walked like a man who refused to yield an inch of the land beneath his boots. Sadie held her breath when Dawson reached the water trough and lowered himself behind it, using the wooden beams as partial cover. He raised his rifle, scanning the ridge and the creek bed with calm, disciplined movements. Sadie saw the side of his face and the faint glow from the lantern he'd left behind, focused, still, and unshakable. Then a voice drifted from the darkness. "Girl!" The shout came from near the tree-line. "You come out now. We don't hurt nobody." Sadie's pulse kicked. The voice was familiar, the taller of the 2 men who had grabbed her on the road. Dawson didn't move. "Come out slow," the man yelled again. "We know you're here. You just make this easier." Sadie stepped forward, but Dawson's voice came low and firm across the yard. "Don't move." She froze, her breath catching. His tone wasn't sharp, just absolute. Another figure emerged from the left side of the ridge, stepping onto the open ground with a shotgun draped across his shoulder. He scanned the barn, then the cabin, then the porch where Sadie stood. "There she is," he said, pointing. "Just hand her over, cowboy. Company pays good coin for women like her." Dawson rose from behind the trough, not fast, not threatening, but in a way that made his presence impossible to ignore. He stepped into the open, rifle pointed downward but ready. "She ain't yours," Dawson said. "Turn around." The man on the ridge laughed. "She's the foreman's now. And you're just some fool living alone on dirt he could buy outright if he wanted." Sadie saw a second man creeping from the creek bed behind the barn. This one the smaller scout they saw earlier. He was trying to circle the cabin. "Dawson," she whispered sharply, "behind you." He didn't turn. "I see him." The smaller man stepped forward, raising a pistol. Dawson lifted his rifle and fired once, hitting the ground inches from the man's boots. Dust jumped, and the scout froze. "I don't want to kill you," Dawson said, "but you're pushing me close." The taller man's grin faded. "We ain't leaving without her." Dawson adjusted his stance. "Then you ain't leaving?" The tension snapped. The scout lunged toward the barn for cover, and Dawson fired again, this time hitting the wood post beside the man's hand. The pistol clattered to the ground. A third rider, previously hidden in the shadow of the ridge, charged forward on horseback, trying to circle behind Dawson. Sadie didn't think, she acted. She grabbed the spare rifle Dawson left by the door, steadied her shakier breath, and aimed at the rider's horse. Not to kill, but to stop. She fired once, hitting the dirt directly in the horse's path. The mare reared, throwing the rider into the ground. He hit the dirt hard and didn't get back up. Dawson heard the shot and turned just enough to meet Sadie's eyes. "Good," he said quietly. "Real good." Before either could breathe, the taller man rushed forward, drawing a knife from his belt. Dawson swung the rifle up, but the man closed in too fast, slashing toward Dawson's side. Dawson blocked him with the butt of the gun, the heavy metal cracking against the man's wrist. The knife dropped to the ground. The scout ran forward then, tackling Dawson from behind. For a moment, the three of them went down in a blur of dirt and limbs. Sadie raised the rifle again, but hesitated. Dawson was too close to the attackers. "Dawson," she cried. "I'm fine," he grunted, shoving one man off while dodging the other's grip. Sadie didn't stay still. She ran toward them, boots thudding, breath breaking, fear forgotten. She reached the dropped knife, grabbed it in both hands, and held it outward. "Stop," she yelled. The scout turned toward her, eyes narrowing. He lunged, thinking she had no strength behind her stance. He was wrong. Sadie lifted the knife and slashed once across his forearm. Not deep, but enough to send him stumbling back with a howl. Dawson used the moment to ram his shoulder into the taller man's chest, sending him crashing into the dirt. "Sadie," Dawson shouted. "Back!" She moved behind him instantly, not out of fear, but because she trusted him more than she trusted her own unsteady hands. The taller man staggered to his feet, clutching his chest. He spit blood onto the dirt. "Foreman's not going to forget this," he hissed. "He'll take your land. Take your stock. Take the girl. You won't be here to see it," Dawson said. The man reached for the dropped shotgun, but Dawson had already aimed. The single shot echoed across the empty land. The man hit the ground and didn't rise. The scout, bleeding and panicked, scrambled to his feet and ran, limping, shouting, terrified. He reached the ridge and disappeared into the dark. Dawson kept the rifle raised until the land went silent again. Sadie pressed both hands to her chest, breath shaking in heavy waves as the reality sank in. She was alive. Dawson was alive. The men who hunted her were either fleeing or dead. When Dawson lowered the rifle, she saw a thin line of blood along his forearm. She ran to him immediately. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for him without hesitation. "It's nothing," Dawson said, but his voice softened when she touched his skin. "You all right?" "I am because of you," she said. Dawson stepped closer, close enough that the heat from his body cut through the night air. Sadie lifted her hands to his shoulders, looking up into eyes that were no longer guarded. "They're not coming back," she whispered. "No," Dawson said. "Not after tonight." He lifted her chin gently, studying her face. "You fought," he said. "You stood your ground. "I learned from you," she said. He breathed out, not a sigh, something deeper, something like relief mixed with gratitude he didn't know how to express. Sadie moved first this time. She wrapped her arms around him fully, pressing her cheek against his chest. Dawson held her tightly, one hand in her hair, the other around her back, anchoring her in a way she had needed her entire life but never received until now. "You're home," Dawson whispered into her hair. Sadie nodded against him. "And I'm not going anywhere." The night settled calm once more, the danger gone, the land still. When they finally pulled apart, Dawson touched her cheek gently. "I want you here," he said softly. Sadie met his gaze without fear, without hesitation. "Then keep me." There was no uncertainty left. Dawson leaned in and kissed her, slow, steady, full of the future he'd been too afraid to imagine. She returned the kiss with the same certainty, her hands sliding up to hold his face, her breath mixing with his in the quiet of the Wyoming night. The threat was over. The fear was gone. Two lives that had collided on a lonely trail now stood together with a shared decision carved clean into the darkness. They chose each other. The following morning, with the ridge quiet and the danger behind them, Dawson saddled his mare and rode with Sadie into town, not to hide, but to make their future official. By sundown, they returned home as husband and wife. And for the first time in both their lives, the cabin on Dawson Hale's land wasn't just shelter. It was family.